Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today, I want to talk with you about something that has sent shockwaves through the American political establishment. Something that many thought would remain buried forever in the vaults of official secrecy. President Trump has authorized the Department of Justice to release files related to Jeffrey Epstein. Now, before we get into what this means, let me ask you a question that should trouble us all. Why did it take this long? Why did these files need a presidential green light to see the light of day in a democracy that supposedly operates on transparency and the rule of law? Ask yourself this question. What happens when a poor man in America is accused of a serious crime? He gets a public defender with 300 other cases. He sits in jail because he can't make bail, and he faces the full force of prosecutorial power. Now ask yourself another question. What happened when Jeffrey Epstein, a billionaire with connections to presidents, princes, and CEO, faced similar accusations? He got a plea deal so lenient that it became infamous. He served minimal time in a private wing of a county jail with release privileges, and the case was sealed from public view. This is not justice. This is a class protection system masquerading as law. The Epstein saga forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality that many Americans already know from experience. There are two entirely separate justice systems operating in this country. For the working class, justice is swift, harsh, and unforgiving. A man caught with marijuana in the wrong state can lose years of his life. A woman who writes a bad check to feed her children can end up with a criminal record that destroys her employment prospects forever. These are the people who fill our prisons, who face mandatory minimums, who get no second chances. But for the wealthy, for those with the right connections and the right lawyers, justice becomes something else entirely. It becomes negotiable. Here's what should shock us. Epstein's 2008 plea deal was so extraordinary that even seasoned prosecutors called it unprecedented. He was allowed to serve 13 months in a county jail rather than federal prison, granted work release for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and the agreement specifically granted immunity to potential co-conspirators. Imagine that. Not only did wealth buy him leniency, it bought protection for others in his network. Meanwhile, thousands of Americans sit in prison for decades under three strikes laws, many for nonviolent offenses that pale in comparison to the allegations against Epstein. The contrast isn't just stark, it's obscene. What enabled this two-tier system? Money bought access to legal talent that knew every loophole, every procedural advantage, every prosecutor who might be persuaded. Connections to powerful people created implicit pressure on investigators to tread carefully. And perhaps most importantly, Epstein existed within a social class that the justice system is culturally conditioned to treat with deference. Prosecutors who routinely throw the book at defendants suddenly found reasons for restraint. Judges who impose maximum sentences on the poor suddenly discovered the virtue of mercy. This isn't conspiracy, it's how class power operates in plain sight. How the system protects those it was designed to serve. Let me ask you something that should disturb every American who believes in transparency and accountability. How does information about crimes involving powerful individuals remain locked away in government vaults for decades? These weren't private diary entries or personal correspondence. These were official files, investigative records, documents compiled by federal agencies using taxpayer dollars, about matters of profound public interest. Yet they sat sealed, hidden from the very citizens whose trust and tax money funded their creation. The agencies tasked with protecting us, the Department of Justice, the FBI intelligence services, chose instead to protect the powerful. Why? The standard explanation is always the same. Ongoing investigations, national security, protecting witnesses. These are convenient bureaucratic shields that sound reasonable until you examine them closely. Ongoing investigations that span decades, national security, concerns about a financier's social network, witness protection that somehow requires keeping the public completely in the dark. These explanations insult our intelligence. What we're witnessing is not legitimate institutional caution, but rather institutional complicity in maintaining a wall of silence around the activities of the elite. Consider the mathematics of this cover-up. Epstein's first major legal troubles emerged in the mid-2000s. His controversial plea deal was struck in 2008. He was arrested again in 2019 and died in federal custody shortly after. That's well over a decade of public knowledge about his activities, yet crucial files remained sealed until a presidential directive forced their release. During those years, how many officials looked at those files and decided the public didn't need to know? How many meetings were held where someone said, "Let's keep this quiet"? How many career bureaucrats and political appointees, spanning multiple administrations from both parties, made the conscious choice that protecting reputations mattered more than truth? Here's what this institutional behavior reveals. These agencies don't primarily serve the public interest, they serve power. When information threatens the comfortable arrangement between political elites, business leaders, and the institutions meant to regulate them, suddenly every rule in the book appears to justify secrecy. But when those same agencies want to surveil ordinary citizens, when they want to prosecute whistleblowers, when they want to investigate activists and dissidents, somehow concerns about privacy and due process evaporate. The double standard isn't accidental. It reflects whose interests these institutions were designed to protect, and it wasn't yours or mine. Here's a fact that should shatter our comfortable political narratives. Jeffrey Epstein didn't pick a side. His social calendar included Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, Wall Street titans, and Silicon Valley moguls. He flew former President Bill Clinton on his private jet. He socialized with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. He donated to politicians across the spectrum and maintained relationships with academics, scientists, and cultural figures who spanned every ideological divide. This wasn't a man operating in one political camp. This was a man who understood that real power in America transcends the partisan theater we're fed on cable news. And here's the question that should haunt us. Where was the bipartisan outrage? Where were the Democrats demanding full transparency about every connection? Where were the Republicans calling for criminal investigations into everyone who enabled him? The silence from both parties has been deafening, broken only by occasional, carefully worded statements that say much by saying little. Both sides seem far more comfortable attacking each other over symbolic culture war issues than confronting the possibility that their donors, fundraisers, and social networks might be implicated in something genuinely monstrous. This reveals something profound about how American politics actually functions. We're told constantly that Democrats and Republicans are locked in an existential battle over the soul of the nation. We watch them fight viciously over judicial appointments, tax rates, and social policies. But when it comes to protecting the fundamental interests of the ruling class, the networks of wealth and power that fund campaigns, stock administrations, and revolve between government and corporate boardrooms, suddenly the fierce partisanship evaporates. Suddenly, there's remarkable consensus that maybe we shouldn't dig too deep. Maybe we should let sleeping dogs lie. Maybe some things are too sensitive for public scrutiny. Think about the implications. Both parties depend on wealthy donors. Both parties draw their leadership from the same elite universities, the same law firms, the same investment banks. Both parties socialize in the same circles at the upper reaches of power. When someone like Epstein cultivated relationships across this landscape, he wasn't bridging political divides. He was operating within a class that shares fundamental interests regardless of whether they register as Democrats or Republicans. The partisan battles we see are real, but they're battles within the elite about how to manage the system, not battles about whether the system itself serves everyone fairly. Why now? That's the question we should be asking about Trump's decision to release these files. After years of these documents sitting in government archives, after multiple administrations came and went without touching them, suddenly we have a presidential directive demanding transparency. Is this a principled stand for truth and accountability? Perhaps, but we'd be naive not to recognize the political calculus at work here. Trump has built his entire political brand on a single narrative. He's the outsider taking on a corrupt establishment that ordinary Americans instinctively distrust. This move fits that story perfectly. Consider the political landscape. Trump faces ongoing legal challenges, intense media scrutiny, and a political establishment that largely views him with hostility. What better way to shift the conversation than to position himself as the truth teller willing to expose what others wanted buried? If these files implicate prominent Democrats, it damages his opponents. If they implicate establishment Republicans, it reinforces his claim that he's different from the party elites. If they reveal institutional corruption and cover-ups, it validates everything he's said about the deep state and rigged systems. Politically, this is a masterclass in controlling the narrative while appearing to simply demand transparency. But here's where it gets interesting. Does the political motivation make the release less important? Absolutely not. One of the great failures of contemporary political discourse is our tendency to evaluate actions solely based on the motives of the actor rather than the merit of the action itself. If a politician proposes a good policy for cynical reasons, is it suddenly a bad policy? If transparency serves someone's political interests, does that make transparency less valuable? We cannot afford to be so simple-minded in our analysis. The American public has developed a sophisticated understanding that our institutions are compromised, that powerful networks protect themselves, that there are truths being kept from us. Trump didn't create this distrust, he recognized it and learned to weaponize it. Whether his motivations are pure or calculated matters less than whether the information released serves the public interest. We can simultaneously acknowledge the political theater while insisting that the substance matters more than the performance. The files should be released not because Trump wants them released, but because in a democracy, citizens have a right to know what their government knows about crimes committed by the powerful. Let's talk about what money actually buys in our society, because it's not just yachts and mansions. Jeffrey Epstein's fortune didn't simply afford him a luxurious lifestyle. It allowed him to construct an entire apparatus of abuse. Private islands where activities could occur far from scrutiny. Multiple residences equipped with sophisticated surveillance systems. A fleet of aircraft that could move people across borders without the inconveniences faced by ordinary travelers. A staff of assistants, pilots, housekeepers, and schedulers who became, wittingly or unwittingly, cogs in a machine designed to facilitate exploitation. This wasn't opportunistic crime. This was systematized predation enabled by concentrated wealth. Think about what this means for a moment. Most criminals must operate within significant constraints. They lack resources, they face surveillance, they can be caught because they leave traces that investigators can follow. But extreme wealth removes these constraints. It creates privacy where there should be visibility. It creates mobility where there should be borders. It creates layers of insulation, lawyers, fixers, confidentiality agreements, settlements, that transform criminal behavior into something that can be managed, contained, and often buried. Epstein's wealth didn't just help him evade consequences after the fact. It enabled the crimes themselves by creating spaces and systems where abuse could flourish. Now consider his victims. These were predominantly young women without resources, without powerful connections, without the kind of social capital that makes authorities listen. In many cases, they came from economically vulnerable backgrounds, precisely the circumstances that predators exploit. When they came forward with allegations, who did the system believe? Who had credible lawyers? Who could afford investigators and public relations teams to shape the narrative? The power imbalance wasn't just interpersonal, it was structural, built into every aspect of how our society allocates voice and credibility based on wealth and status. This is what we mean when we talk about how capitalism and exploitation intersect. Epstein's case isn't just about individual moral failure. It's about how concentrated economic power creates the conditions for abuse. When wealth can purchase privacy, mobility, legal protection, and silence, it effectively creates zones where normal rules don't apply. When poverty strips people of agency, credibility, and options, it creates populations vulnerable to exploitation. The system didn't just fail to stop Epstein, the system gave him the tools. Here's the uncomfortable truth that history teaches us. America loves a scandal, but America resists transformation. We excel at public outrage, at watching powerful people fall from grace, at the spectacle of investigations and hearings and media firestorms. What we consistently fail to do is ask why the structures that enabled the scandal remain intact after the headlines fade. We replace the disgraced individuals, we implement superficial reforms with impressive names, we declare victory over corruption, and then we're shocked when the next scandal emerges following the exact same pattern as the last one. So let's be clear about what's at stake with these Epstein files. Names will emerge. Reputations will be destroyed. Some people will face legal consequences, others will quietly retreat from public life, and still others will somehow weather the storm with their power intact. The media will dissect every revelation, social media will explode with outrage, politicians will give speeches about accountability and justice. And then what? Does the justice system that gave Epstein his sweetheart plea deal get fundamentally restructured? Do we democratize wealth so that no individual can accumulate the kind of resources that create zones of impunity? Do we reform our political system so that it stops being dependent on donations from the very class that benefits from looking the other way? History suggests we won't. We didn't after the financial crisis, when bankers who crashed the global economy faced no criminal charges while millions lost their homes. We didn't after the Panama Papers revealed industrial-scale tax evasion by the wealthy. We didn't after countless other revelations of elite corruption and institutional failure. We had the scandals, we had the outrage, and then we returned to the comfortable fiction that our system basically works, that this was just a few bad apples, that we don't need structural change because we're fundamentally sound, but we're not fundamentally sound. The Epstein case isn't an aberration. It's a window into how power actually operates when you strip away the mythology. The real question isn't who gets named in these files. The real question is whether we finally have the courage to confront why our institutions consistently protect wealth and power at the expense of justice and human dignity. Are we willing to restructure economic power? Are we willing to eliminate the two-tier justice system? Are we willing to break up the networks of privilege that operate across party lines? Because if we're not, then this is just another scandal, another moment of performative outrage before we all go back to accepting a system that was never designed to serve us. The Epstein files are not just a political earthquake. They are an opportunity, an opportunity to have a serious national conversation about justice, about power, about what kind of society we want to be. Will we take that opportunity, or will we simply enjoy the scandal, watch a few heads roll, and then return to business as usual? That, my friends, is the question that will determine whether this moment means anything at all. Thank you.